Welcome to this episode of Evidence of Greatness, where we look at various research studies and we draw applications to solution-focused brief therapy. And for this episode, I'm going to be looking at a study called Pygmalion in the Classroom. And this study was done by Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson. And this study is actually quite old. It was done in 1965, but I think that it has some really important practical applications for us as solution-focused therapists. So I wanted to take some time to consider this study. The research question that was evaluated in this study is whether within a period of 1 year, one academic year, or less, children of whom greater intellectual growth is expected will show greater intellectual growth than the undesignated control group children. And what this means is they divided up groups of kids and they selected some out, and they told the teachers, and these kids were between first grade and sixth grade, some in each grade. And they told the teachers of these students that these select students actually showed signs of greater intellectual ability. So in essence, they were gifted or something like that. And they wanted to see, and it was really arbitrary. They had no idea if these kids were indeed more intellectually able than others, but they just selected them at random. They were put into that, what they call the experimental group. And then the teachers were told these kids show greater signs of intellectual ability. And they wanted to see if the teachers having this expectation, if it would result in, by the end of the year, greater intellectual achievement. So they wanted to see, in essence, will this self-fulfilling prophecy actually become true? And this is probably not very considered very ethical by today's standards. So I would be surprised if this kind of a study could be conducted again. But I think that there are some really important results that come out of this research. So they looked at 4 different variables. The first was basically age. They wanted to know if children in the lower grades or the higher grades would be influenced by this expectation effect. And one of the things that they mentioned and quoted from other research is that age is an important factor in determining the degree to which an organism can be shaped, molded, or influenced. So they kind of had this idea that children were really malleable, that they were adaptable. And so they wanted to see if this was true and if it differed by age, if younger or older children were more or less malleable than others. The second variable that they were looking at is what they called the track variable. There were kids who were previously designated as slow track, medium track, or fast track learners. And in here, they described this as susceptibility to social influence may not be too contingent upon a child's intellectual status. So they were saying, in essence, there's expectation of social influence. Are there some kids that are more susceptible to social influence than others? And does intellectual ability change the level of social influence ability that they have? Interestingly, they talked about how boys tend to be overpopulated in the slow tracks and girls tended to be overpopulated in the fast track. And then they also were looking at, which we'll come back to a little bit, a minority group. And the minority group in this particular school was what they called Mexican children. And Mexican children tended to overpopulate the slow track and underpopulate the fast track. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, but they wanted to know, does it matter what track you're on around social influence? And does that intersect with your perceived intellectual ability? The third variable that they looked at was sex. And they thought about the influencer, or in this case, the teacher, the sex of the teacher should potentially have an impact. And also, based on previous research, they said boys should be more susceptible to social influence than girls. Therefore, their intellectual achievement should be greater, boys should be greater than girls, based on this susceptibility to social influence. And then finally, they looked at a minority group. Again, these are kids who they classified as Mexican-looking children. How Mexican did the children look? And again, I understand that that terminology probably wouldn't be appropriate today, but that's how they classified them in 1965. They did this by asking 2 teachers who were not part of the study to evaluate or look at each of the children who were participating and rate them as Mexican looking or non-Mexican looking. And those ratings between the 2 raters were correlated at 0.97, which means in essence, they agreed almost every single time on how minority looking they were perceived. So they looked at these 4 variables and they said, do these variables impact intellectual achievement? So then here are the results. We'll just jump right into it. What you can see on this chart is that down the left-hand side, you see the grade levels. And then you see in the next 2 columns, the control groups. You see how many students were in the control group. There were a total of 255 students in the control group. And just over the course of that year alone, so without any expectation, those children on average gained 8.42 IQ points, which makes sense. You think about they're going to learn and their intellect is going to improve over the course of 1 year. So we'll expect that their IQ would go up some. So you can see across the board in every grade, IQ improved. You can see, I'll point out a couple of things in just a minute, but if you then look at the next 2 columns, this is the experimental group. So these are the kids whose teachers were told they have some exceptional ability, intellectual ability. And you can see, again, they all improved over time, but this group as a whole, which was comprised of 65 students, their overall IQ score raised by 12.22%. So a third more, or 50% more than the other group combined. So just at face value, you can see that these kids did outperform those kids who were not told, whose teachers were not told that they had increased intellectual ability. Now, one of the things that you want to then do is look at each grade. And then, so this column, this second to last column, tells you how many more points were increased by the experimental group or potentially intellectually advantaged kids over those just traditional kids. So you can see in first grade and second grade, the improvement was quite significant, that those perceived intellectual children outperformed or grew their intellectual ability. So this would suggest that it was confirmed that the hypothesis was if the teachers are told they will perform better, then they actually do. Now you can see over these higher grades that those results are not the same. Third grade, fifth grade, there was perceived no difference. They improved exactly the same. In fourth grade, actually, there was a little bump. And then in sixth grade, the traditional students outperformed very slightly. Now, I just want to point out one thing here with fifth grade. You can see that 17.5 and 17.4, but the difference was 0.0. These symbols, minus and plus, that indicates rounding errors, right? So this rounded to 17.5 and this rounded to 17.4, but in actuality, they were virtually the same. And then this last column over here says, what's the probability of getting these results? And you can see that these are statistically different results for first grade and second grade, and overall, that 3.8 IQ points overall is statistically significant. Now that's probably weighted because of the significant increase of first grade and second grade students. So that's what they discovered. Now, I'll talk a little bit about what these results then mean. Obviously, like we just mentioned, children in first grade and in second grade experienced a greater expectancy advantage. Younger children benefited the most. Now, in just a minute, I'll talk about why these results might be what they are. But the second is track. And this one I think was really, really important and significant. None of the statistical tracks showed any difference among the three tracks. So if they were in the slow track, the medium track, or the high track, they didn't have any difference in their intellectual scores at the end of the year. This one is also, I think, really valuable, which is the consideration of sex. On total IQ, girls showed a slightly greater advantage to boys. On verbal IQ, boys showed slightly greater advantage to girls, and on reasoning IQ, girls showed a slightly greater advantage to boys. If you take these three things together, basically what they concluded was each group profited from the teacher's prophecies in the area of intellectual functioning in which they already had a little advantage. So just from other research, we know that boys typically had an advantage in verbal IQ and girls had an advantage in the reasoning IQ, and they performed slightly better in those areas in which they already had an advantage. Now, think about that from a solution-focused perspective. If we are reliant on our clients telling us what they want, telling us what their strengths are, their resources are, those kinds of things, and then we treat them as though they're capable of accomplishing even more in those areas in which they teach us about, then that self-fulfilling prophecy could actually come into play, where what they're already good at could be exacerbated, and they could even get better or show increased results in that particular area. So I think that's a really important finding. And then in this minority group status, in total IQ, in verbal IQ, and in reasoning IQ, children of this minority group were more advantaged by the favorable expectation than were other children, though the difference were not statistically significant. So what that just said is that in all three of the IQ measurements, minority children showed greater improvement simply because their teachers thought they were capable of that improvement. Now, again, think about this from a solution-focused perspective. If there is somebody who comes in and they were diagnosed with PTSD, or they were diagnosed with bipolar disorder, or they were diagnosed with substance abuse disorder, by traditional standards, many clinicians would say, well, they're not expected to change because these are such significant issues, these are such significant problems. And in essence, simply by telling the teacher, these kids have potential, they were able to achieve that potential at greater rates. So if all we do as clinicians is think, I might be meeting with somebody who has greater potential despite the significance of their problem, we might actually see them improve significantly simply because we believe that they're capable of change. So I think the result here is not so much about the result of the kids, but it is about the expectation of the teachers. And in essence, we should walk in thinking, I might be meeting with somebody who is very capable of change despite the issues that they're managing. And that self-fulfilling prophecy may come about. And so I think the lesson there, the takeaway here is for us to engage with each person as though they might be capable of change, because we don't actually know if they are or if they aren't, but they could be advantaged simply because we're approaching them in that way. And I really like this last little quote here. It says, teachers' pre-experimental expectations of the more Mexican-looking boys' intellectual performance was probably the lowest of all. These children may have had the most to gain by introduction of more favorable expectations into the minds of their teachers. In essence, they were told boys are typically rowdy, they don't pay attention, they can't learn as well as girls. Minority children are not as smart as the mainstream population of children, therefore they're not capable of achieving as much. But that actually ended up being not true. The kids who were marginalized the most experienced the most growth if their teachers simply looked at them different. Think about that from a solution-focused perspective. If the people who are considered the least likely to change or the least likely to benefit from therapy come to us and we simply hold the expectation that they're capable of change, then they're most likely to experience change. These children may have had the most to gain by the introduction of this favorable expectation. These clients may have the most to gain if our expectations turn to favorable expectations. So I think that in and of itself is significant for us. Despite the fact that the findings said maybe younger children had more to gain than older children, maybe boys had more to gain in a particular area or girls had more to gain in a particular area, I think this particular finding is the most significant. The kids who came from the lowest status probably had the most to gain, and they did. So here are some of the conclusions that I think are important. One person's expectation of another's behavior may come to serve as a self-fulfilling prophecy. In essence, one therapist's expectation of a client's behavior may serve as a self-fulfilling prophecy. They might get better simply because we treat them as though they're capable of getting better. They then go into some of these possible explanations, and they talked about how younger children are generally more malleable, which is relevant, but I think this next one is really important. Younger children had less well-established reputations within the school. If I'm in third grade or fourth grade or fifth grade, then my previous teachers could tell my current teacher, oh, that's not true, that kid does not have intellectual abilities. So they might be influenced by a previous reputation. Think about that in a therapeutic perspective. If previous clinicians are able, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, case managers, if they're able to tell us and influence our perception of our client, then they might not benefit as much. Whereas if we walk in with a completely clear slate and we look at them and we think they may benefit from this process, perhaps excluding the previous reputation alone would be significant enough to turn how much they might benefit from this process. In addition, I think this is a really important consideration, is that they said perhaps the changes were because teachers of young children were more malleable. And it's interesting, if you go to that very last bullet point, the administrators were asked to rate the effectiveness of the teachers, and multiple administrators rated those younger grade teachers as more effective. So if you think about it, if you walk your role, how well you do your job, how well you hold this expectation of people, it may have an impact on them. Perhaps these younger children's teachers were able to hold this perspective of them better than older teachers. So maybe it had nothing to do with the children at all, but it had everything to do with how well the teachers could hold this expectation. And obviously that's transferable to us as clinicians. Perhaps change, and if you go back to my previous evidence of greatness from last month, you'll see our own hope could significantly impact our clients' hope. So our perception of our clients could significantly impact the outcomes of change. And then they talked about how there may be some sampling errors, that maybe children were sampled incorrectly or teachers were sampled incorrectly, and that might have influenced the results. But I think well, first of all, here's the final reference in case you want to go find that study. But I think as you think about this study, in essence, it's saying how I think about, how I view my clients, it could very well have an impact on them. Perhaps the impact is they'll get better at things that they're already good at. Perhaps the people who have the least positive perceptions of themselves or have had previous reputations of having a bad ability, perhaps they could benefit from us holding this value of them. Perhaps my expectation, if I hold a valuable expectation of people, that could change them. So I think what this all boils down to is that we as helping professionals may, and I would probably say, go as far as to say, will impact the outcomes of our clients simply by how we view them, simply by how willing we are to listen to them versus how willing we are to listen to previous professionals who have a poor perception of them. And so I hope that the takeaway that you get from this process is our perception of our clients could and probably does impact the therapeutic outcomes that they achieve. So my personal takeaway is view everyone as capable, view everyone as malleable to change, view everyone as a meaningful person to connect with, to understand what they're good at, to enhance what they're good at, because that's probably going to influence positive outcomes of therapy more than many, many other things. So I hope that was helpful. Please let me know what you think. I'd be happy to hear what your thoughts are about this process. And until then, have a great month and come back and enjoy Evidence of Greatness again next month.